Case 1. Jodi Arias. The 4th day of June, 2008, Maricopa County Superior Court. Travis Alexander was a rising star in his community, a motivational speaker, a devoted member of his church, a man who mentored young people and dreamed of building a life of purpose in Mesa, Arizona. Nobody in his circle of friends and family could have imagined that the woman he had once loved would become the reason his story ended so abruptly and so publicly in front of the entire country. Jodi Arias had met Travis at a business convention in Las Vegas. What followed was a relationship marked by passion, but also by volatility, one that continued in some form even after their official breakup, with Arias making the long drive from California to Arizona on more than one occasion. On this particular day, she made that drive again, arriving at Travis's home in Mesa under circumstances that, at the time, seemed unremarkable to those around him. What happened next would not become clear to investigators or to the public for a long time. Travis failed to show up for a planned group trip to Cancun. Friends who couldn't reach him grew worried. When they went to check on him themselves, they made a discovery that would shake the quiet community to its core. Travis had not survived. The scene inside his home told investigators that his final moments had been marked by extreme and prolonged violence, sustained in the most intimate space in his own house. Detectives moved quickly. Digital evidence, including a camera recovered at the scene, would later become central to unraveling what had actually happened that day. Arias's own trail, from cell phone records to gas station receipts along her route back to California, began to paint a picture that contradicted the story she initially told police, that she had not been anywhere near Mesa in the days surrounding Travis's death. When confronted, Arias's account shifted dramatically. First, she claimed that masked intruders had broken into the home and were responsible for what happened to Travis, and that she had narrowly escaped harm herself. As investigators picked apart the physical evidence, that story fell apart, and Arias changed her account again, this time asserting that she had acted alone, but only because she feared for her life. The case exploded into a media phenomenon almost overnight. Cameras packed the Maricopa County courtroom. Legal analysts, talk show hosts, and true crime followers around the world tuned in as prosecutors laid out a timeline that painted a picture of calculated, methodical actions rather than a desperate act of self-defense. The defense, meanwhile, argued that years of documented emotional and physical mistreatment in the relationship had pushed Arias to a breaking point. The trial stretched on for months, becoming one of the most closely watched criminal proceedings in modern American history. Jurors listened to weeks of graphic testimony, expert analysis, and cross-examinations that often turned personal and combative. When the jury returned its verdict, they found Jodi Arias guilty of first-degree murder. The sentencing phase that followed was itself dramatic, resulting in a hung jury on the question of the death penalty, not once, but twice. Ultimately, on April the 13th, 2015, a judge handed down the sentence that would define the rest of Arias's life, natural life in prison, without any possibility of parole. For Travis Alexander's family, the sentencing brought a measure of closure after years of anguish, media scrutiny, and reliving the worst days of their lives in a public courtroom. For the broader public, the case remains a haunting study in how relationships can spiral into unimaginable tragedy, and a reminder of how important it is for anyone experiencing an unhealthy or dangerous relationship to reach out for help. Organizations like the National Domestic Violence Hotline exist for exactly this reason, offering confidential support to anyone who needs it at any hour. Travis Alexander's memory lives on through the people who loved him and through the case that continues to serve as a cautionary tale about obsession, betrayal, and the devastating cost of unchecked rage. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Case 2. Shawna Forde. The 30th day of May, 2009, Pima County Superior Court. In the small, quiet desert community of Arica, Arizona, tucked close to the U.S. Mexico border, neighbors looked out for one another. It was the kind of place where a knock on the door late at night would normally be met with concern, not fear. But on this night, that knock brought horror into the home of Raul Flores and his family. An act of violence born not from a chance encounter, but from a twisted ideology and a woman's ruthless ambition. Shawna Forde had positioned herself as the leader of a self-styled Border Patrol militia calling itself the Minutemen American Defense. She used the language of border security and vigilante justice to recruit followers. But behind the rhetoric was a woman driven largely by financial desperation and a hunger for power within her small, radicalized following. Forde became convinced, wrongly, that Raul Flores was a major player in narcotics trafficking, and that robbing his home would net a fortune to fund her group's operations. Late that night, Forde and two accomplices approached the Flores home disguised as law enforcement, a deception designed to get the family to open their door willingly. Once inside, the intrusion turned deadly with terrifying speed. Raul Flores did not survive the encounter. In an act that shocked even seasoned investigators, the assailants also targeted his 9-year-old daughter, Brasinia, ending her young life in the family's own living room. Raul's wife, though shot herself, survived the attack, and it was her testimony, delivered with extraordinary courage, that would ultimately help bring Forde to justice. The investigation that followed peeled back the layers of Forde's militia operation, revealing a chaotic and volatile world of stolen weapons, internal betrayals, and increasingly reckless behavior. One of her own accomplices eventually became a key witness against her, describing in detail how the plan to rob the Flores family had spiraled into a night of unthinkable loss. Prosecutors argued that Forde had orchestrated the entire operation from start to finish, and that the deaths inside that home were the direct, foreseeable result of the invasion she had planned and led. The trial drew national attention, in part because of the disturbing questions it raised about vigilante border groups operating with little oversight in the desert borderlands, and in part because of the sheer, senseless cruelty of a child's life being cut short. In February of 2011, a jury convicted Shawna Forde on 2 counts of first-degree murder, along with related charges. The court sentenced her to death, and she remains today on Arizona's death row, one of only a small number of women in the state to receive that sentence. The case of Brasinia Flores continues to be invoked in conversations about child safety advocacy and community accountability, a reminder that vigilantism dressed up as justice can bring devastating consequences to the most innocent among us. Organizations dedicated to child protection and victim advocacy, such as the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, continue working to support families affected by violence and to push for stronger protections for children everywhere. Raul and Brasinia Flores are remembered by their community not for the horror of that night, but for the life and warmth they brought to Arivica before it was so unjustly taken from them. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Case 3. Wendi Andriano, the 8th day of October, 2000, Maricopa County Superior Court. In the sprawling suburbs east of Phoenix, in a home that from the outside looked like any other on a quiet residential street, a young family was fighting a battle that seemed, at first, to be purely medical. Joseph Andriano, known to friends and family simply as Joe, had been diagnosed with cancer and was engaged in the exhausting, all-consuming fight that so many families know too well: the hospital visits, the treatments, the long nights of uncertainty about what tomorrow would bring. His wife, Wendi, appeared to the outside world to be standing by his side through it all, playing the role of devoted caretaker while their children looked on, trusting that their mother had their father's best interests at heart. But behind the walls of that home, something far darker was unfolding. As investigators would later reconstruct in painstaking detail, Wendi Andriano was not fighting for her husband's life. She was working, deliberately and repeatedly, to end it. She had access to a toxic agricultural chemical, sodium azide, and began introducing it into food and drink that only her ailing husband would consume. For a woman already trusted with the daily care of a sick man, it was a chillingly simple method of harm, one that exploited the very intimacy and dependence that illness creates between a patient and a caregiver. What investigators would uncover is that the poison did not act quickly enough to achieve what Andriano wanted. Joe, already weakened by his illness, began to suffer additional, unexplained symptoms that alarmed those close to him. But by the time anyone connected the dots, the situation in that home had already escalated far beyond poison. On the day in question, Joe Andriano suffered catastrophic injuries inside his own home, injuries so severe that they immediately raised red flags for the detectives who responded to the scene. The evidence pointed unmistakably to an attack that had been sustained and intentional, carried out by someone who wanted absolute certainty that this time there would be no survival. As the investigation deepened, a motive began to take shape that was as calculated as the act itself. Wendi Andriano, prosecutors would later argue, stood to gain significantly from her husband's passing, not only through a substantial malpractice settlement tied to his medical care, but also through the freedom to pursue relationships outside her marriage that she had already begun exploring before his death. Investigators uncovered a trail of communications and financial records that painted a picture of a woman who had grown tired of her marriage and impatient with the slow toll of her husband's illness, and who ultimately chose the most permanent solution imaginable rather than walking away. The trial that followed was a methodical, often harrowing presentation of forensic and toxicological evidence, expert testimony, and the chilling story of a marriage that had curdled into calculation. Prosecutors laid out, piece by piece, how the poisoning attempt had failed and how the violence inside that home had escalated as a result. The defense pushed back, attempting to characterize Andriano as a woman overwhelmed by the burden of caregiving, but the physical evidence and the clear financial motive proved difficult for jurors to look past. In 2004, a Maricopa County jury convicted Wendi Andriano of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to death and remains on Arizona's death row today, one of the small number of women incarcerated under a capital sentence in the state. Her case remains a difficult but important reminder of how the trust placed in a caregiver can, in the rarest and most tragic circumstances, be catastrophically betrayed, and why programs supporting elder and patient care oversight, as well as resources like adult protective services, exist to help protect vulnerable individuals who depend entirely on the people closest to them. Joe Andriano's story is remembered not for the tragedy of his final days, but for the life he lived before illness and betrayal. Cut it short. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Case 4. Sammantha Allen, the 12th day of July, 2011, Maricopa County Superior Court. Some cases stay with an audience not because of their complexity, but because of their almost unbearable simplicity. A small act of childhood mischief met with a punishment so disproportionate, so calculated, that it becomes almost impossible to comprehend. This is one of those cases, centered on a 10-year-old girl named Inoue, whose bright spirit and quiet resilience masked a home life that had, for years, been shadowed by cruelty. Inoue lived with extended family in a home in Mesa, Arizona, under the care of her cousin, Sammantha Allen, and Allen's husband. To neighbors and casual observers, the household may have looked unremarkable, but investigators would later learn that Inoue had endured a sustained pattern of severe mistreatment at the hands of the adults responsible for her. Treatment so troubling that when the full picture emerged, it left even veteran detectives struggling to process what they were seeing. On this particular day, Inoue's offense was almost heartbreakingly small. She had taken a popsicle from the freezer without asking permission. For most families, this would be the kind of moment that ends in a gentle scolding, forgotten by dinner time. In this household, it became the pretext for a punishment that would end Inoue's life. The adults responsible for her decided that the appropriate consequence was to force the small child into a plastic storage container, a box measuring barely 3 feet in length, far too small for a child to move freely inside. They secured the container with a padlock from the outside, ensuring she had no way to free herself, and left her there through the night, in the punishing heat of an Arizona summer. By morning, Inoue was gone. The container that had been meant as punishment had become, in the most literal sense, a sealed chamber with no escape and no relief from the suffocating heat, conditions that claimed her life sometime during those long overnight hours while the adults responsible for her safety slept nearby. The investigation that followed exposed a pattern of abuse that extended back for years, described by relatives and acquaintances who came forward once the case became public. Investigators learned that Inoue had endured repeated punishments involving confinement and severe physical discipline, treatment that neighbors and family members had either failed to recognize for what it was or had failed to report. The tragedy prompted intense scrutiny of the child welfare systems that had, at various points, crossed paths with this family without fully grasping the danger Inoue was living in. Sammantha Allen and her husband were charged with first-degree murder and child abuse. Prosecutors argued that this was not a single moment of poor judgment, but the tragic culmination of a long pattern of cruelty inflicted on a child who had no voice and no way to protect herself. The evidence presented at trial, from witness accounts of prior incidents to the physical conditions investigators documented at the scene, left little room for doubt about what had happened and why. In August of 2017, Sammantha Allen was convicted and sentenced to death, becoming the most recent woman added to Arizona's death row. Her husband faced his own separate proceedings and consequences for his role in Aine's death. Deal's story has since become a rallying point for child welfare advocates across Arizona and beyond, a painful but necessary reminder of how easily warning signs can be missed and how vital it is for neighbors, teachers, relatives, and anyone who suspects a child may be in danger to speak up. The Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline exists for exactly this reason, offering a confidential way for anyone, at any time, to seek guidance or report concerns about a child's safety. Aine's memory lives on as a quiet, determined reminder that every child deserves protection, safety, and a voice, and that a community's vigilance can be the difference between life and tragedy. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Case 5. Valerie Pape, January 2000. Torso discovered on the 26th day of January, Maricopa County Superior Court. Scottsdale, Arizona has long carried a reputation for upscale living. Manicured golf courses, luxury resorts, and quiet residential streets where marital troubles, if they existed at all, were assumed to stay behind closed doors. It was in one of these comfortable homes that Valerie Pape lived with her husband, Arias, a man 20 years her senior whose relationship with his younger wife had, by all accounts, grown increasingly strained and turbulent in the months leading up to that January. Friends and acquaintances who knew the couple described a marriage under mounting pressure, marked by arguments over money, trust, and the widening gap between the life Pape wanted and the one she felt trapped inside. What none of them could have anticipated was how catastrophically that tension inside the Pomerantz household was about to erupt, or the almost unbelievable circumstances under which the truth would eventually come to light. Ira Pomerantz did not survive an encounter with his wife inside their own home. In the chaotic and disturbing aftermath, Pape made a series of decisions that investigators would later describe as coldly methodical. Rather than reporting what had happened, she began the grim task of removing evidence of her husband's fate from the home, working to conceal what she had done in a manner that suggested extensive premeditation about how to avoid detection. The unraveling of her plan came from one of the most unlikely sources imaginable. A person searching through a dumpster in the area happened to witness Pape removing a suspicious, heavy bag from the trunk of her car, a bag that, upon closer inspection, contained undeniable evidence of what had taken place inside the Pomerantz home. That single, chance observation by a stranger became the thread that unraveled the entire case, leading investigators directly to Pape's door within days. As detectives pieced together the full timeline, they uncovered a home life that had been unraveling for far longer than anyone outside the marriage had realized. Financial records, witness statements from neighbors and friends, and physical evidence collected from the home all painted a picture of a relationship that had reached a breaking point. One where Pape ultimately chose an irreversible and violent solution rather than pursuing separation through more conventional means. Facing the possibility of a first-degree murder conviction and the substantial prison term that would come with it, Pape's legal team negotiated an agreement with prosecutors. In 2002, she pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, a resolution that spared both sides the uncertainty of a lengthy trial while still holding her legally accountable for her husband's death. She was sentenced to 16 years in the Arizona prison system. Pape would go on to serve her full sentence, and upon her release, having never held U.S. citizenship, she was deported back to France, closing the final chapter on a case that had gripped Scottsdale and much of Arizona for years. For Ira Pomerantz's loved ones, the case remains a somber reminder of how even relationships that appear stable and prosperous from the outside can conceal danger, and how important it is for anyone feeling trapped or unsafe in a relationship to seek outside support long before tensions reach a breaking point. Resources like the National Domestic Violence Hotline remain available around the clock for exactly these situations. Ira Pomerantz is remembered by those who knew him as a man of considerable warmth and generosity, whose life was cut short in a manner no one close to him could have ever predicted. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Case 6. Marissa DeVault, the 14th day of January, 2009, Maricopa County Superior Court. Gilbert, Arizona is one of the fastest-growing suburbs in the Phoenix metro area, a community built around family neighborhoods, good schools, and the kind of quiet streets where late-night emergencies are rare. It was here that Dale Harrell believed he was building a stable life with his wife, Marissa DeVault, unaware that the marriage he was in had become entangled in debt, resentment, and a plan that would end with him fighting for his life in a hospital bed for weeks before he lost that fight entirely. By all appearances, the DeVault household was under significant financial strain in the months leading up to that January. Behind the scenes, prosecutors would later reveal, Marissa DeVault had taken out a substantial life insurance policy on her husband, $300,000, at a time when the couple's debts were mounting and their financial situation had grown increasingly desperate. It was a detail that, on its own, meant little. Combined with what happened next, it became the foundation of the prosecution's entire case. While Dale slept in their home, he was attacked with a claw hammer, struck repeatedly about the head in an assault so severe that he never regained the life he had before that night. He survived the initial attack, clinging to life in a hospital for weeks as his family held on to hope that he might recover. But the injuries were too catastrophic. On February the 9th, 2009, Dale Harrell succumbed to the damage inflicted on him, becoming, in the eyes of the law, a homicide victim rather than a survivor. When detectives began investigating, DeVault offered an account that initially seemed to fit a tragic but sympathetic narrative. She claimed that years of domestic and sexual abuse in the marriage had finally caused her to snap, and that the attack on her husband was an act of self-preservation after enduring years of suffering in silence. It was a defense designed to appeal directly to a jury's sense of compassion, and in a different case, with different evidence, it might have carried real weight. But as prosecutors built their case, the financial trail told a very different story. The timing of the life insurance policy, the depth of the couple's debt, and DeVault's own communications in the months before the attack all pointed toward a motive rooted far more in financial desperation than in a desperate act of self-defense. Investigators also uncovered inconsistencies in DeVault's account of the abuse she described, inconsistencies that prosecutors argued undermined the credibility of her defense. The trial became a battleground between two competing narratives, one of an abused wife pushed to her breaking point, and one of a calculating spouse who saw her husband's death as the solution to a mounting financial crisis. Weeks of testimony, expert analysis of the physical evidence, and DeVault's own statements to detectives were laid out in painstaking detail for the jury. In April of 2014, the jury reached its verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. 2 months later, on June the 6th of that year, Marissa DeVault was sentenced to natural life in prison without the possibility of parole. Dale Harrell's family, who had waited more than 5 years for the case to reach its conclusion, finally received the accountability they had sought since that terrible night in Gilbert. The case remains a difficult but important example of how allegations of abuse must be weighed carefully and fully against all available evidence, and a reminder that anyone genuinely experiencing domestic violence has real, confidential options for escape and support long before a crisis point is reached, through resources like the National Domestic Violence Hotline. Dale Harrell is remembered by his family as a man who deserved far better than the fate that found him in his own bed, in the home he believed was safe. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Case 7. Pamela Phillips, the 1st day of November, 1996, Pima County Superior Court. Outside a country club in Tucson, in the kind of upscale setting where wealthy Arizonans gathered for business, leisure, and the easy comforts of success, Gary Triano's life ended in an explosion so calculated, so deliberately engineered, that it would take investigators nearly 2 decades and an international manhunt to fully bring the woman behind it to justice. Gary Triano was a well-known figure in Tucson's business circles, a man whose divorce from his wife, Pamela Phillips, had been contentious but appeared, on the surface, to have settled into an uneasy peace. Phillips had moved on to a life of considerable luxury, splitting her time between Arizona, and a lavish lifestyle in Aspen, Colorado, one that required a steady stream of money to sustain. What investigators would eventually uncover is that Phillips had found a solution to her financial appetite that was as ruthless as it was elaborate. A $2 million life insurance policy on her ex-husband, and a plan to collect on it by ensuring his death looked nothing like an accident, and everything like an unsolvable mystery. On the day in question, as Triano left the country club, a remote-controlled pipe bomb hidden in his car detonated, an act of violence so audacious that it immediately signaled to investigators they were dealing with someone far more calculating than an ordinary domestic dispute suspect. The bombing sent shockwaves through Tucson's business and social community, raising urgent questions about who could have possessed both the motive and the technical capability to carry out such an attack. The investigation moved slowly at first, hampered by the sheer sophistication of the crime and Phillips's efforts to distance herself from any connection to it. But over time, investigators identified a man named Ronald Young, a hitman Phillips had allegedly hired to carry out the attack, in exchange for a share of the insurance payout she stood to receive. As detectives built their case against Young, the trail led directly back to Phillips herself, whose motive, that substantial insurance policy and her increasingly expensive lifestyle, became impossible to ignore. Rather than face prosecution, Phillips fled the country, beginning a pursuit that would stretch across international borders for years. She was eventually located in Austria, where authorities began the long legal process of extraditing her back to the United States to face charges in connection with her ex-husband's death. The extradition process itself became a significant legal battle, drawing media attention as prosecutors worked to bring Phillips back to Arizona soil to finally answer for the bombing that had haunted the Triano family and the Tucson community for so long. When the case finally reached trial in 2014, prosecutors presented nearly 2 decades of accumulated evidence, financial records detailing the insurance policy, communications linking Phillips to the plot, and testimony connecting her directly to the hitman she had allegedly hired. The jury convicted Phillips of first-degree murder and conspiracy, and she was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, finally closing a case that had remained open for far longer than most of Arizona's law enforcement community ever expected. For Gary Triano's family, the conviction came after nearly 18 years of uncertainty, a reminder of how persistence in the pursuit of justice can eventually catch up with even the most calculated and far-reaching schemes. The case is also frequently cited in discussions about the dangers of contract violence carried out for financial gain, and the importance of law enforcement's continued investment in cold case units that keep working long after a case fades from public attention. Gary Triano's memory endures in Tucson as a reminder that justice, however delayed, remains possible. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Case 8. Rachel Henry, the 20th day of January, 2020, Maricopa County Superior Court. Phoenix, Arizona is home to millions of families, and on any given day, in any given neighborhood, the small, ordinary chaos of raising young children plays out inside countless homes. The laughter, the exhaustion, the constant demands of caring for babies and toddlers who depend entirely on the adults around them. In one modest home in Phoenix, that ordinary chaos gave way, on this January day, to a tragedy so profound that it left even hardened investigators struggling to process what they found. Rachel Henry was a mother of 3 young children, a 3-year-old, a 1-year-old, and an infant of only 7 months. To extended family and to those on the periphery of her life, she may have appeared to be simply an overwhelmed young mother, navigating the demands of caring for 3 children so close in age. But on this day, something in Henry's household shifted in a way that would end all 3 of her children's lives within the span of a single, harrowing sequence of events inside their own home. What investigators documented at the scene was almost impossible to reconcile with the everyday domestic setting around it. After her children did not survive, Henry arranged their small bodies on the living room couch in a manner designed to appear peaceful, as though they were simply napping, a detail that would haunt investigators and prosecutors alike throughout the case. She then continued about her day as though nothing had happened, spending time with family members who had no idea of the horror that had just unfolded in the next room, before ultimately confessing to what she had done. The case sent shockwaves through the Phoenix community and drew intense scrutiny from child welfare advocates, mental health professionals, and prosecutors alike, all grappling with the same difficult question. How does a mother reach a point where she ends the lives of the very children she was entrusted to protect? Investigators worked to piece together Henry's state of mind in the days and weeks leading up to that January day, examining whether warning signs had been missed by anyone in her circle of family, friends, or medical providers. As the legal process unfolded, Henry ultimately chose to change her plea to guilty, sparing the community and the surviving family members the added pain of a lengthy trial that would have required reliving the details of that day in open court. In 2022, she was sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, a sentence reflecting the enormity of the loss inflicted on 3 separate young lives. The case remains one of the most difficult in Arizona's recent history, not because of any complexity in the legal proceedings, but because of the almost unbearable scale of the loss. 3 siblings, an entire generation of one family, gone within moments. It has become a case frequently referenced by child welfare organizations and maternal mental health advocates alike, underscoring how critical it is for struggling parents to have access to support before a crisis reaches an irreversible point. Resources like the National Maternal Mental Health Hotline exist specifically to provide confidential, 24-hour support to parents who feel overwhelmed, and organizations such as Child Help remain available for anyone concerned about a child's safety. The 3 children are remembered by their extended family as bright, growing lives full of promise, gone far too soon, and their story continues to serve as a painful but necessary reminder of why community vigilance and accessible mental health support matter for every family. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Case 9. Inoue, the 15th day of May, 2021, Maricopa County Superior Court. Tempe, Arizona, home to Arizona State University and a large, diverse population of young families, is not the kind of place most residents associate with tragedy on the scale that unfolded inside one modest apartment on this May Day. Inoue lived there with her 2 children, a 9-year-old daughter and a 7-year-old son, in the aftermath of a marriage that had grown increasingly strained amid disputes with her estranged husband, many of them centered on the family's deteriorating financial situation. Those closest to Inoue in the days before the incident described a woman under mounting emotional and psychological strain, though few, if any, recognized the full extent of what she may have been experiencing internally. On the day in question, while her 2 children slept in their beds, Inoue used a kitchen implement to attack them, ending both of their young lives inside the apartment they called home. What followed was one of the more unusual sequences investigators had encountered in a case of this nature. Rather than fleeing or attempting to conceal what had happened, Inoue drove herself directly to a nearby police station in the hours after the attack. She walked in and approached the officers on duty, telling them directly that she had harmed her children and describing, in unsettling detail, that she had been hearing voices in the days leading up to the attack. Voices, she said, that told her to hurt her children. This self-disclosure immediately shaped the direction of the investigation and the legal proceedings that followed. Prosecutors and defense attorneys alike were forced to grapple with difficult questions about Inoue's mental state at the time of the attack, and mental health experts were called in throughout the legal process to evaluate what role, if any, a psychiatric break may have played in the events of that day. Despite the questions raised about her mental state, the legal process ultimately proceeded toward a determination of guilt on the underlying charges. The case moved through the Maricopa County court system over the following years, a process complicated by the psychiatric evaluations, competency questions, and careful legal consideration that cases involving alleged mental illness typically require. Ultimately, a jury found Inoue guilty of first-degree murder in connection with the deaths of both of her children. On May 2, 2025, a Maricopa County Superior Court judge handed down her sentence. 2 consecutive natural life sentences, along with an additional 35 years in prison. A sentence reflecting both the severity of the loss and the court's careful consideration of the circumstances presented throughout the case. The case of Inoue has become an important, if painful, touchstone in ongoing conversations about maternal mental health, postpartum psychiatric conditions, and the urgent need for accessible mental health intervention for parents in crisis. Advocates point to this case as a stark illustration of how untreated or unrecognized psychiatric symptoms can, in the rarest and most devastating circumstances, lead to unimaginable tragedy, and why it remains critical for family members, friends, and healthcare providers to take seriously any signs of a parent in psychological distress. The 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline offers immediate, confidential support for anyone experiencing a mental health crisis, including parents who fear they may be a danger to themselves or others. The two children are remembered by extended family in Arizona and Japan as bright, curious young lives, whose story continues to shape conversations about mental health awareness across the state. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Case 10. Lori Vallow Daybell, the 11th day of July, 2019, Maricopa County Superior Court. Few cases in recent American criminal history have captured public fascination quite like the story of Lori Vallow Daybell, a case that stretched across 2 states, involved a tangled web of religious extremism, family betrayal, and multiple lives lost, and ultimately became one of the most widely followed true crime sagas of the past decade. While much of the darkest chapter of this story unfolded in Idaho, its roots, and one of its most pivotal chapters, traced directly back to Chandler, Arizona. Lori Vallow had, by the late 2010s, become deeply immersed in a network of increasingly radical religious and doomsday-oriented beliefs, ideas that grew more extreme with each new relationship and each new influence in her life. Central to this belief system was a disturbing framework in which Vallow came to view people around her, including, investigators would later reveal, her own children, through a lens of spiritual corruption, describing some individuals as being possessed by dark spirits, or as having become what she and her closest confidants referred to as zombies, no longer truly themselves in a spiritual sense. At the center of this unraveling family structure was Lori's marriage to Charles Vallow, her 4th husband, a relationship that had grown increasingly tense as Lori's beliefs became more extreme and as a new figure entered her life. Chad Daybell, an author of apocalyptic religious fiction whose own beliefs dovetailed disturbingly well with Lori's evolving worldview. As the relationship between Lori and Daybell deepened, tension inside the Vallow household escalated, culminating in the events of that July day in Chandler, Arizona, when Charles Vallow was shot and killed by Lori's brother, Alex Cox, inside the family home. At the time, the shooting was characterized by Cox and Lori as an act of self-defense, and for a period, the case did not immediately draw the intense scrutiny it would eventually receive. But as investigators in Idaho would soon discover, this shooting in Chandler was only the first visible thread in a far larger and more disturbing pattern of violence connected to Lori Vallow and her expanding circle. In the months that followed, Lori relocated to Idaho with Chad Daybell, and it was there that the case exploded into a nationwide story. Lori's 2 youngest children, Tylee Ryan and JJ Vallow, vanished, sparking a desperate search effort that captured headlines across the country. Investigators would eventually discover that both children had lost their lives. Their remains recovered on property connected to Daybell, alongside evidence connecting their deaths to the same web of extreme beliefs that had consumed Lori in the months prior. Compounding the horror of the case, investigators also connected Lori and Daybell to the death of Tammy Daybell, Chad's previous wife, whose passing had initially been attributed to natural causes before subsequent investigation revealed a far more troubling picture. As the Idaho case proceeded through its own legal process, one that would ultimately result in Lori Vallow Daybell being convicted and sentenced to life in prison for the deaths of her 2 children, Arizona prosecutors pursued their own separate charges, tied specifically to the death of Charles Vallow in Chandler and to an additional conspiracy charge connected to a plot against Brandon Boudreaux, the ex-husband of Lori's niece, who had also been targeted in a shooting that he survived. Following her convictions and sentencing in Idaho, Lori Vallow Daybell was extradited back to Arizona to face these outstanding conspiracy charges tied to her home state. The Arizona proceedings brought the case full circle, allowing prosecutors in Maricopa County to hold her accountable for the events that had, in many ways, set the entire tragic chain of events into motion years earlier in Chandler. On July the 25th, 2025, a judge sentenced Vallow Daybell to 2 additional consecutive life prison sentences in connection with her Arizona charges, ensuring that regardless of any future legal developments in other jurisdictions, she will spend the remainder of her life behind bars. The case of Vallow Daybell has become one of the most studied examples in recent memory of how extremist belief systems can consume a family entirely, erasing the bonds that are supposed to protect children most of all. It has prompted renewed conversations among mental health professionals, cult intervention specialists, and child welfare advocates about the warning signs of radicalization within family units, and the importance of intervention before belief systems escalate into violence. Organizations such as the International Cultic Studies Association continue to provide resources and support for families concerned about a loved one's involvement in high-control or extremist groups. Charles Vallow, Tylee Ryan, J.J. Vallow, and Tammy Daybell are remembered by the family members who continue to advocate for them, a reminder of how quickly extremism can tear apart the people it claims to protect. Don't forget to like and subscribe.